fan fiction existed way before podcasting existed. All beliefs have consequences. I had a belief that the harder you work, the more you should earn. I also had a belief that the harder something is to do, the more valuable and the more you would earn doing that most difficult task. I want to do things that are incredibly valuable, such as absolutely shift the way people think and feel about things in life so that they can break free from any limiting belief, behavior, thoughts, or emotions that are keeping them from creating and or doing whatever they want to do in this world.
Hey, sponsor my show. How does it work for a podcast around the series?
Podcast around the series would be a little bit...
Man, that's such a good hack.
You can launch a podcast about a television show today, and the more popular the show is, the bigger your results are going to be if that's what you're looking for. One of the things that I've learned is that...
So, Cliff, I have received and hosted episodes with people who had 2 shows or people who had a few shows, one after the other. You actually have, how many shows did you tell me a bit earlier?
I have 53 different podcast shows and nearly 4,800 podcast episodes.
All right. So now talking about podcast gurus, I think we're right in the theme. So please tell us what is happening here.
Well, for me, I got started in podcasting in December of 2005. I was listening to Leo Laporte as he started his Twit network, if you're familiar with him at all. Adam Curry had turned him on to podcasting. Of course, Adam Curry and Dave Winder are the 2 people who founded the technology of the media enclosure and an RSS feed creating podcasting. And so when I discovered that Leo Laporte had this podcast and he told me about Adam Curry's daily source code, and then in the same week I heard about a guy named Father Roderick von Hogen, a Catholic priest in the Netherlands who's podcasting, I started listening to those 3 podcasts like every single episode that was being released. It was incredible to have this different experience of content that I could consume whenever I wanted to that really spoke to my interests of technology, pop culture, and just what's going on in the world in other places. And it's not the typical sports radio, politics, and all this other stuff. It's like, wow, podcasting is amazing. And then, of course, I discovered all sorts of other incredible podcasts. And my wife and I were watching a television show called Lost at the time. And I was blogging about this television show. And one day I decided, oh, by the way, I found 5 different podcasts, fan podcasts devoted to the television show Lost. And I listened to every episode of every Lost podcast that was out there. And one of them was Ryan and Jen Azawa from Hawaii. And they had a podcast called The Transmission. And I decided, after writing a very in-depth analysis, a theory about what's the mystery on this television show, I recorded a 3.5-minute audio clip describing the blog post with all of my description of what I think is happening. And what happened is my 3.5-minute audio file was played in their podcast, and then the next day, my blog was shut down. Yeah, I logged in. It says bandwidth exceeded, server suspended, contact accounting. And they said I owed them thousands of dollars. Yeah, the reason why is because Entertainment Weekly had been listening to their podcast, and EW.com wrote an article about my blog post, and they sent millions of people to my little blog on a shared hosting server. So that was my introduction to the world of podcasting, is, introducing me to that way. And then all of a sudden, I had a handful of people who heard my audio feedback, including Ryan and Jen, who were the hosts of that podcast. They said, Cliff, you should create your own podcast. And so I decided I'm going to create a podcast. And I thinking, well, there are already 5 people who are 5 different podcasts on the topic of Lost, and most of my stuff I get from them and online forums. So I don't know that anybody will want to hear me talk about this. This was my limiting belief at the time. And then I thought, well, the other passion I have is technology. So if I'm going to launch a podcast about technology, well, wait a second. The only people who know anything about podcasting are all tech enthusiasts and tech journalists. And so they already know more than I do about technology. And then at the time I thought maybe faith. And well, it's like the Christian radio broadcasters had already started their podcast. It's like, so I didn't think anybody would ever listen to me. So I created a podcast. My first ever show was called Generally Speaking. And the idea is that I would generally speak in each episode about a specific topic for which I was passionate about. The three most common would be tech, faith, or lost. And so I did a first episode introducing that, and I said, don't worry, I know some of you will be interested in the lost, but not the other two, or vice, in any random combination of that. So what I will do, the episode titles will start with the keyword. It'll be either lost, faith, or technology. And you'll notice this first episode says lost. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And then I started talking about lost. To my shock, 500 people downloaded that episode within 24 hours. And I got feedback via email that says, Cliff, please, whatever you do a podcast where every episode is about lost. I could care less about your faith. I don't care about listening about technology, but man, I could listen to you all day long talk about lost. So the second episode was technically the launch of we rebranded the show. And I said, hello, everyone, and welcome to the weekly Lost edition of the Generally Speaking Podcast Network. Because right then and there, I knew that this was going to be one show of a network of different shows. And I invited my wife to join me, and I think we did 262 episodes of the Lost podcast. By the third episode, we were invited to join this group feed that we had in Blogger at the time. It was called the Lost Podcast Network. So we all had our own RSS feeds for our podcasts. By the way, we were all manually creating these RSS feeds. There was no software tools like we have today. But we also syndicated in a blog RSS feed, a blogger like that was purchased later by Google. And by our third episode, my wife and I in Northern Kentucky had 27,000 subscribers around the world. And as a result of that, we started getting lots of emails about the things that we would talk about. People were asking questions. The things that were related to Lost, we would include in the show. And for every topic that wasn't related to Lost, I wrote back and said, hey, do you mind if I answer this in a podcast and read your email and respond to you there? I'm getting lots of other emails with the same question. I would launch various different other podcasts on other topics.
Man, that's crazy. So for those who don't know, Lost might not ring a bell right now, but back in 2000, I think it's 2006 it started, right? Or 2004, 2006. Like probably the most watched series, or one of the most watched. It would be the Game of Thrones of a few years ago, basically. It's like, it was the thing the most watched of. It's basically a bunch of people who crash on an island, and there is a huge mystery around the series. Not gonna spoil, although I guess that much time afterwards there is no spoil anymore. But it was big. So when you started blogging and podcasting about it, just had huge traction. That's crazy.
Yeah, and the great news was this was the same time when we started podcasting about Lost, was the same time that Apple decided to incorporate podcasts into iTunes. And that was also the same time that they made television shows, episode by episode, available for purchase. So I want you to imagine this. There are millions of people who are signing into iTunes so that they can go pay $2.99 to purchase that most recent episode that they just saw on television so that they could watch it again and own it. And then as they did the search, it shows here's the music related to Lost. Here's the TV show related to Lost. Here are the podcasts related to Lost. And right next, by the way, the television show Lost was run by Carlton Cuse and Damon Lindelof, the showrunners for the show, executive producers, and they had their own official Lost podcast. And our podcast, Cliff and Stephanie, was right next to theirs.
Man. So do you know the crew of Lost personally now, Cliff?
Do I know the crew personally?
Did you get to meet them? Because then you built something at that time that was like, I guess, highly linked to the Lost brand as a concept, right?
So I did not meet any of these individuals in person. However, Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse did listen to our show. The actor Jorge Garcia, who played Hurley, he listened to our show and would call in and leave feedback. And Daniel Day Kim, who played Jin, he also listened to the show. And they said that there were others who also were listening to us. And also the vice president of marketing for Disney also listened to our show. And the interesting thing at the time is that we did a lot of audio clips from the show. So I would go and I would record 2.5, 3-minute pieces of audio clips from the show. And I would play those in our podcast, and then we would react and respond to them as we're going through and doing our analysis, which I asked a friend of ours that was high up in the company, and I said, hey, do you think we're going to get in trouble? She goes, stop. Don't ask the question. I already know what you're going to ask. And if you ask, I have to refer you to legal, and legal will shut you down.
Holy cow.
But what was implied, though, is if you don't ask, we never had this conversation, and technically we have it, so don't ask questions. And by the way, that is in no way would I ever recommend that you take anybody else's intellectual property, their copyrighted material, audio clips. It is something that I would never do again today, but I did do for that show.
I mean, it's also back in days where there wasn't any clear rules, I guess, not as widely known as today, right? If you had to ask the head of legal about doing that, like it means it wasn't obvious. So nowadays it's clear that you can just not use somebody else's property.
I'll be honest and authentic and transparent. I was quite aware of what was allowed and what wasn't allowed.
Oh, really? Oh, shoot. I love that, Cliff.
Yeah, I was quite aware, and I went into this with a philosophy that worked well in my case, but could have easily gone in a very bad direction. But I had this philosophy at the time: it's easier to ask for forgiveness than to seek permission.
So there is so much to unpack into everything you said, Cliff. The first thing I'm thinking about is syndication. How did you know about what a podcast syndication back then was, a podcast network? Like, how did you even come around doing everything like that?
I have been an early adopter to technology since I was a kid. So when I was 3 years old, I took apart and tried to figure out this FM modulator that was inside of a handheld piece of plastic called Mr. Microphone. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that device, but it was you put little batteries inside of it, and there was a little aluminum antenna, and you would turn it on, and it was a microphone, and you could broadcast your voice to a local radio tuned to the right frequency. And so I'm 3 years old playing with this thing, hearing my voice broadcasted on radio. So that was the earliest little hint of this. Then when I was 8 years old, my dad purchased a Commodore VIC-20. And he had no clue what to do with it. So I said, hey, do you mind if I take a stab at this? I plugged it up to the TV, opened up the owner's manual, and at 8 years old, I taught myself how to program BASIC from the user's manual. And ever since then, when in 1995, I discovered that they created this web HTML language that I could learn, and it's not a whole lot different than learning the language of BASIC and some other programming languages. So like, this seems pretty easy. And so I used angelfire.com, and I had my free hosted website that I was hand coding HTML files to publish to the web. And we didn't even have a term for it. We called it my online web journal. And later they called it the online weblog. And then they eventually called, and it was coined as a blog. And so I was blogging way before blogging existed. And then, of course, like I said, I was blogging eventually about the television show Lost, while also, as soon as podcasting was they created it, I was pretty much there right after it was invented, and I just did some research. How do you create a podcast? And it's like, well, you have to know RSS code, and you need to know what a media enclosure is. And that wasn't I learned all of that in an afternoon. And I'm like, well, I already have equipment that I can record my audio. I can download free software called Audacity to convert my audio file into an MP3 file. I can host that on my shared hosting account, which I don't recommend today. But back then, that's what I did. And then I'm like, I can use a text editor and update my RSS feed with each new episode manually and just plug that up there. And believe it or not, there were still, even back then, there were like 3 different podcast directories that you could submit your RSS feed to. And it was the early days, but that's how I got into it.
How do you go from that to that one podcast about Lost? Well, this podcast network of faith, Lost, and technology to 53 podcasts. Like, how does that even come to mind?
So, yeah, my wife and I did the podcast about the television show Lost together, and we saw what was happening there. We had advertisers come to us, Time Warner Cable, DirecTV, a bunch of other international brands saying, we'd like to advertise, we'd like to be a sponsor for your show. We know that you're getting lots of attention, and we'd like to pay you money each month for mentioning us. And we'll, basically you'll earn some income. I'm like, sweet. And then I'm like, hey, if we had other shows, would you consider sponsoring those? And so my wife and I had the Desperate Housewives fan podcast, the Grey's Anatomy fan podcast, the Private Practice fan podcast, the Doctor Who fan podcast. Eventually, we branched out into some books series, such as the Twilight Saga podcast, which, by the way, that one is one people could still go to today. Go to twilightsagapodcast.com. That podcast today, you can go to twilightsagapodcast.com and find out whenever the last episode was. It was a long time ago. Actually, it wasn't that long ago. We did come back and do a little bit on Midnight Sun. But still, that podcast today, every single episode gets a few thousand downloads every single month right now. You could go to hungergamespodcast.com, and that show still gets a few thousand downloads today. Eventually, I had a decision that, wow, I wonder what life question. I thought, what would life be like if I could do this for a living instead of selling insurance in the family-run insurance agency that I work in? This is so fulfilling. This is so satisfying what I'm doing. And then I had people say, Cliff, you know what? Can you teach me how to podcast? And I'm like, sure. I wish I had more people I could talk to about podcasting. Everybody else is bored to tears about me going on and on about podcasting. And so that's all I ever wanted to talk about. And I would get on calls with people and I would answer their questions about the technical aspects of podcasting. I'd help them buy the right equipment. I'd help them set up their RSS feed and teach them how to copy and paste and update it manually and all this other stuff. And they're like, Cliff, let me pay you to do this. I'm like, I feel like I should pay you for letting me talk to you about podcasting. And that's how, and by the way, this reminds me of a great philosophy as well. And that is, find something that you love to do so much that you'd be willing to do it all day long for free. And then become so excellent at doing that thing that people would be willing to pay you to do it. And that's what happened for me. All of a sudden, I'm putting out anywhere between 5 to 7 podcast episodes a week at this time. This is by late 2006, early 2007. So 5 to 7 podcast episodes a week. And people are saying, Cliff, will you teach me how to podcast? I'm willing to pay you. And at this point, I'm making between $3,000 to $5,000 a month just doing this as a hobby, playing around. And I'm like, what would life be like if I was actually doing this full time? And I could devote the full 40 hours of my main productive hours in my work week if I could do this. And that was a scary time in my life to have that thought and that process, but I actually pursued it. And I started to talk to people, and I got some coaching and some encouragement along the way. And in September of 2007, I made a decision to put my 90-day notice in. And as of January 1st, 2008, I was full-time self-employed as a podcast content creator and podcast coach and consultant. And that's what I was doing for a living. And the first year of my business was very tough because I had the mindset of an employee still, and I didn't know what I didn't know about business. But boy, I was excellent at creating content. And I got to the place where I started podcasts like Business Tech Weekly So we would talk about technology tools that you can use in your business to be more productive and more efficient and to keep you on task and more disciplined. So every week I'm learning new things about how to run a business. So I created a podcast called Business Tech Weekly. Of course, we were all on board back then in the earliest days of Twitter, the earliest days of Facebook. We started out on MySpace and Frapper Maps, and only a few people will understand even what a Frapper Map is. But anyway, that's how far back we go. And so social media was becoming a thing, and it was changing all the time. And some people were becoming obsessed. Their life was being consumed by social media. And I saw some of those tendencies in myself. So I created a podcast called Social Media Serenity. Now, prior to all of this, I had been a lifelong kind of Windows user all the way back to Microsoft DOS. And I came back from BASIC. So I went from Microsoft DOS to Windows 3.0, 3.1, Windows 95, 98, XP. And then, of course, Vista said, I'm sorry, Microsoft, I can't go to Vista with you. This is terrible. You guys have lost your way. And so I bought a Mac computer for the very first time. And I'm like, this is using a different side of my brain. And there's so many things that I don't understand. By the way, with Business Tech Weekly, I took a friend of mine who was also into business and was relatively new, and he was into technology, and I had a co-host for that. And I had another friend of mine who was into social media as much as I was. And I had him for a co-host for that. And then I had a friend of mine who was an Apple genius at the Apple store in my local hometown in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I asked him if he would actually come on to my podcast that I had launched called Help, I Got a Mac. And so this is how these podcasts got launched. And of course, I can't forget to say that I created I think it was my third or fourth podcast was titled Podcast Answer Man. And that was ultimately what would be the biggest revenue generator for just over a decade.
Cliff, there's too many questions I want to ask you. The first one is a podcast about a series or about a book series or a saga. Would you recommend launching something like that? Because I just checked what you are walking us through this. So Hunger Games, Twilight, those were all launched 2009, 2011. Would you recommend doing something like this nowadays? Would it work, you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I've trained. So, by the way, I didn't. This hasn't come up, but I've personally trained more than 40,000 people how to launch a podcast. I will say that yes, you can launch a podcast about a television show today, and the more popular the show is, the bigger your results are going to be if that's what you're looking for as far as audience size and things of that nature. But yeah, go and look for podcasts just go into Apple Podcast directory and search for any major television show. Like, for example, Westworld, or if you look up, there's a brand new show. My wife and I just checked out this short little mini series called Shogun. Now, I haven't done this yet, but I bet you there's a Shogun podcast, even though it's a mini series on one of the networks. Yep. So, but anyway, take any major television show that has a wide audience. The Gilded Age, by the way, has their own podcast, and I'm really loving it when a television showrunner actually understands the value of having behind-the-scenes look and explanations of how did you come up with that. Really, can you explain to me what I just watched? Because this is so complex, it's bending my mind. But yeah, there's podcasts about just about any major television series, book series, movie franchise, and sometimes just a single movie could have its own podcast.
So, stupid question, but let me pick your brain a bit here. What do you talk about on the podcast about the series? Do you say, hey, that's what I thought about the latest episode? Do you go into the details of, hey, I know that behind the scenes that was exactly this? Oh, by the way, did you know that, I'm thinking about Lord of the Rings right now. Did you know that when Aragorn shot into the helmet, he actually broke a toe? Like, what do you talk about on a podcast like this?
Exactly what you just said. Anything you want to talk about. There are some people who are so heavily invested in a fantasy world, And for them, they love that. Matter of fact, I'm sure you've heard of fan fiction. Fan fiction existed way before podcasting existed. And so there are people who actually read novels written by amateurs that are absolutely terribly written in some cases. By the way, I'm not suggesting that all fan fiction is written by terrible people. But if you are interested enough, you will consume any content. I will give you a perfect example. When I was a kid, in the 1984, I would come home and I would turn on Nickelodeon. They were playing at the time some British sci-fi kids television shows from the late 70s. And it was called the Third Eye series. And one of those shows was a program called Children of the Stones. It is amazing. And by the way, just do a YouTube search, Children of the Stones full, F-U-L-L. You can watch the entire thing and thank me or hate me later. Let me tell you something. I'm going to get something.
So I bet we are about to see a book or something that Cliff made himself that is related to the Children of the Stones. And I'm checking on YouTube right now. It's indeed, you have a video which is probably the full series, but it's only 2.5 hours long. So it could be interesting. Let me audio describe. So Cliff is right now holding a kind of vinyl kind of pouch. That's it. Vinyl album, exactly. Children of the Stones.
This right here.
It's beautiful.
A vinyl album, Children of the Stones. It is beautiful. And let me tell you, it is nothing more than the soundtrack to the music and themes of the various different backgrounds of the scenes. That's all it is. And I'm going to pull something up here, so I got to figure out what's going on with my phone. I want to do this. Okay, so Children of the Stones soundtrack. I'm going to plug in my phone, and I'm going to bring this in here, and I'm going to click.
Man, this episode is turning into something completely new, and I love it.
Now, it's already started. You can just barely hear it. And then there's...
That's interesting.
So okay, I'll stop it there. But here's what I'm saying. So this show was probably, I think it was in 7 parts, a mini series. And I have watched this television show, Children of the Stones, once or twice a year, every year for the last 13 years, ever since I rediscovered it as an adult. Not only that, I have watched countless people on YouTube watching the show, pausing it, and then speaking about what they just watched.
So you find a big show enough, and then you just create content around it, and you have fans.
Or, by the way, that was not a big show. That's what I'm getting at. That wasn't a big show. That was a niche show. There's a very small group of people. However, I am a part of the Children of the Stones fan community on the Facebook group, and we have found each other.
Man, the things internet enables, it's crazy. But that's so cool. That's a world I had no clue about. So my sister is a huge fan of fan fictions, so I know about that pretty well. Well, not as much as her, but this whole world of like aficionados of a specific, even niche series or niche book series, that's crazy. That's crazy. So yeah, you can really, if you do things well, you can create an audience, or you can get an audience around the topic that you love and that other people love.
Yeah, and also just to put a bow on the conversation to the answer of the question of what do you talk about, the biggest thing that my wife and I always did in our conversations, whether it's a book about Twilight, it's one of the Twilight book, the Hunger Games podcast, or books and or movies, because we also covered the movies in some of those cases, and these television shows, what we'll do is we'll talk about what we just witnessed in the show, but we will also talk about how that scene made us feel, how we resonate with what the character was thinking. Why did they do that? I would have never done that because here's how I think about it. Here's what I think they should have done. Or, you know what? I can so relate. There's been so many times in my life where I've done that and blah, blah, blah. And of course, when my wife and I are podcasting together, we also talk about our relationship together. And it's, there's an endless amount of things that you could talk about in a fan podcast.
So the sponsorship model that you mentioned earlier, Cliff. So you have people reaching out to you, say, hey, I want to give you money for you to mention my brand on your show. How does that work with a branded podcast around the show? And to refine a bit the question, if I go to a podcast that, I don't know, specializes in HVAC, for instance, it's pretty easy to get sponsored as long as you have a big audience, right? You ask product providers within the space of HVAC, hey, I'm having that audience that is directly related to HVAC professionals or people being fans of HVAC. There are some, hey, sponsor my show. How does it work for a podcast around the series?
Well, a podcast around the series would be a little bit more of a broader audience. However, what I would recommend that you do is find out if that show is a network television show, for example, and if there are advertisements that are shown in between the episodes, those are the people you want to reach out to sponsor your podcast. Because they're already sponsoring that content. They already recognize the value of the audience that watches that show. They've already done their homework, and trust me, they're spending a whole lot more money for that television ad than you'll probably be comfortable asking for your podcast.
Man, that's such a good hack. Wow, I love this. Why going for, because I think you mentioned it earlier in the episode, why going mostly for solo hosted podcasts or with your wife and not, say, interviewing guests that could be around the series or any of the other podcasts that you have?
So I think it has a lot to me for just personal preference. That's why I chose to do it. I like to talk, and of course, I'm done several thousand podcast interviews at this point, so I'm very good at taking a break and letting you jump in and have questions. However, occasionally I've had a guest or an interviewer who've come in and said, hey, Cliff, tell me a little bit about your story. And 40 minutes later, they may have asked me 2 or 3 questions because they never jumped in. But I can solo host. I can monologue this entire thing. It's like, Guillaume, thanks for inviting me. I'll let you know when I'm done.
Cool, guys. Thank you. I'm going to fetch a coffee.
So the thing is, I love to talk. So for me, I have a lot of thoughts about a lot of interests, and I have a lot of passions. And every time I find something that I'm passionate about, I'm all in or I'm not interested at all. That's just my persona. That's my personality. It's just how I've shown up in the world. So when I develop a new passion for something, I will invest hundreds, if not thousands of hours of study into that thing. And I'm like, well, gosh, I'm already doing all this. I should create a podcast about it or a series of content about it. And it's very rare that I can find people out there who are as passionate or can talk around at the depth that I can about something that I've just learned. So I end up doing those shows and those series of episodes as solo hosted content. Then occasionally, of course, I like podcasting with my wife just because she's amazing. And it's a lot of fun to talk about the things that we experience together. And then other friends around other topics. When I'm going to have a co-host, it's usually a topic that I have an interest in. But my area of expertise is on the newer side of things. My interest is it's a newer interest. So I like to take somebody who has a lot more experience, a lot more education, a lot more of expertise in that area, and have conversations. And I get real curious, and I like, let me share with you what I learned and tell me what I'm misperceiving based upon how I'm understanding this. And so I love to have co-hosted conversations. I am better today at interviews. Now, like I said, I have almost 4,800 podcast episodes. I've probably done about 500 interviews since 2005. Not all of them have been great. In the early days, it had a lot to do with my lack of emotional intelligence at the time, a lot of my own ego-driven personality. A lot of that has evolved. I'm not as ego-driven as I once was. And back in the day, I was more interested in what I had to say than what other people had to say. Not proud of that, but it was what it was. Today, I could definitely pull off an interview-based podcast. And in fact, I do have one show that I launched called What Are You Creating? I did a series of podcast episodes, had great success, and then I just lost interest and stopped producing it for a very long time. I'm thinking about bringing it back. It's called What Are You Creating? And it's all about people who are what I would call a creator in the world, that they're actually creating something that people are like, wow, how does one come about creating something like that? What was the journey? What was the process? What's the mindset? How many failures did you have to overcome? How did you learn how to do that? When did this start showing up for you? I love getting the behind the scenes story. And it's only recently that I have interest in creating that kind of content. The weird thing is, for a long time, the story that I told myself about why am I not doing more interview-based content, and what I used to say to that question is, I just don't like listening to interview-based podcasts. I like to be a guest on interview-based podcasts and be exposed to an audience that loves to hear interviews. And here's what I can tell you. Like, okay, so there's, who is it? It's Tom Billio, and there is, gosh, what's his name? Joe Rogan and Lewis Howes and some of these other people that I've known for many years. They have these podcasts. They have massive audiences. They're incredibly popular. They're pumping out content all day, every day, it seems like, and several hours of content. And what I do is occasionally they will interview somebody that inspires me, that I look up to, or at least that I have a deep, profound interest in who they are and what they're creating in the world. And then I go and I listen to that, and I'm like, oh, man, that interview with Elon Musk and insert name of podcast host was absolutely amazing. And then, wow, that Jordan Peterson, it's kind of neat to get a little bit more in-depth understanding of who he is behind some of the weird stuff I've heard him say in social media. And, it's like, man, some of these people are really cool to hear their behind-the-scenes story. And it seems to me that it's mostly people who have achieved a certain level of success or fame or celebrity, or they've done something that is incredibly impactful in the world, and a lot of people recognize them. And those interviews, I'm really interested. And I could listen to practically anyone interview them as long as the questions are good and everything. And so occasionally I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm going to go ahead and resubscribe to Lewis Howes or Joe Rogan or whatever. Insert name of podcast interview format. And what happens to me is I go and I download the episodes that I want to hear, and I archive all the ones that I have no interest in. They continue to pump out content every single day, and I keep deleting the ones that I don't want. And eventually I'm like, okay, I haven't gotten to those ones that are in the archive yet. They're not that interesting to me. And they keep getting a red dot of how many things I'm behind on. And I go and I unsubscribe from the podcast within a week and a half to 2 weeks of subscribing to it. And I'm like, And there's some part of me that wonders, well, if that's how I do it, I wonder if a lot of people do it. And maybe that's subconsciously why I don't create my own interview-based format podcast.
That makes lots of sense. Just to follow up on one of the things you mentioned, I think that's the huge benefit of podcasts, which is long format, right? Back to the interview thing where you can actually take the time to listen to somebody speak for 2-3 hours. When you talk about Elon Musk, for instance, there is an interview of him on the Lex Fridman's podcast. I think the interview is 4 hours long. It's just because some podcasters, when they go like the full length of what the podcast can do, right? They take the time. They don't edit out. And it's like, yeah, it won't be as stimulating and dopamine frying as a short that you would just consume in 30 seconds. But you would get to go much more in depth with the understanding of the person, what they think on different topics as well, because you might disagree on some of them for some stuff. But on other, you're like, oh, shoot, that's something or a perspective I didn't even consider. But that also makes sense that when it comes to your podcast, you'd rather be solo or with your wife. Totally appreciate that. what are the things that you've learned? Back on one of the previous things, Cliff, but I really want to make the most out of this because it's amazing. What are the things that you did learn as a business owner when you said you had the employee mentality and kind of made mistakes based on that? So what were those kind of challenges that you encountered, and that's especially in the podcast world, which makes it even more relevant for us, that you are like walking around and make sure, okay, that's how it needs to be tackled in this specific setup?
Well, one of the things that I've learned is that all beliefs have consequences. And when I started working for myself, I had a belief that the harder you work, the more you should earn. I also had a belief that the harder something is to do, the more valuable and the more you would earn doing that most difficult task. Now, I did not know that I had these. These were what we call unconscious beliefs for me in 2008. I was completely unaware. I was hypnotically living my life under those two beliefs and some other ones like you shouldn't steal from people, and all this other stuff. And so how that looked for me, I'll give you an example. At one point, I had eventually raised my rates to $300 an hour. And I had a client who had hired me to teach him how to podcast. He also bought about $2,000 worth of equipment. My profit on that order was about $600. By the way, I'm making these numbers up, except for the $300 an hour, just to have an idea. So I have dedicated internet trolls at this point who like to fact check all of the different things I've said in different places. Like, you're a liar, Cliff. So, by the way, I've learned to have thick skin when it comes to internet trolls. So, anyway, here's what happened. I had this client, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I just made $600 profit on this equipment order. And not only that, he's hiring me for 2 hours to teach him how to hook it up step by step by step by step. So, wow, that's another $600. I just made $1,200 profit, and the equipment order took me 25 minutes, and I'm going to have 2 hours. So it's like in 2 hours and 25 minutes, I just made $1,200. And back then, that was a lot of money for me. So we go through, we set everything up, and everything was working great. About 3 or 4 months later, this client reaches out to me and says, hey, Cliff, I wonder if you can help me. I'm running into an issue with my JK audio broadcast host. And this is what we used to have to use to have telephone calls brought into our audio recording equipment. And I said, sure. What's going on? He goes, well, I came back from vacation and I can't hear the other person on the line. There's this static noise. And I'm like, well, you remember I told you were going to have static. That's just a part of this, and you're amplifying the noise floor. And he says, no, Cliff, it's not that. And he says, can I get on your schedule? Can you help me troubleshoot it? I'm sure you can help me figure this out. And I said, sure. So do you know that I'm a minimum of, it's $300 an hour with a minimum of 1 hour. He says, sure, go ahead and put me on your calendar. I said, well, I'm booked for the next 2 weeks. Is 2 weeks on Tuesday? Is that okay? He's like, okay, yeah, no worries. Put me on your calendar. And so I'm sitting here thinking, it's like, man, I feel so guilty, and this guy should wait so long, right? So what I did is I reached out to him and said, hey, just so you know, JK Audio, the manufacturer, has this toll-free number that you can call for tech support. They're wonderful. I've called them before. And if they can't solve it, they'll have you ship the thing back to them, and they'll send you a new one. So just and he says, Cliff, hey, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. But if it's okay with you, and if you're still available, I'd like to keep my scheduled appointment with you. And I'm like, okay, sure. So the time comes. This is way before Zoom, but let's just pretend we have a Zoom call. So there's a Zoom call scheduled. He jumps on the line about 5 minutes early, just kind of like I did before our call today. And so about 5 minutes before our 1 hour is, by the way, I used to believe that people would pay you for your time. All right, so that was an additional belief on top of the other beliefs that I talked about earlier. So what happened was he he tells me he came back and he can't hear people on this telephone line. And I'm like, okay, great. I'm here. I'm going to call you. What's the phone number to your studio? And so I call his number. It rings. He hits the button and I'm listening and I instantly hear a noise. And I know what it's a feedback loop is what it's called. And I sit there, I said, hey, I hung up. I said, do me a favor. Reach behind the JK Audio broadcast host, unplug the power cord from the back. And he said, okay, did the lights go out? Yes. Plug it back in. And he said, okay. And I said, I hit redial and I said, hello, can you hear? He goes, I hear you great. Wow, Cliff, this is amazing. This has taken us 90 seconds. And do you want to know what he said to me? Cliff, thank you so much. Send me the invoice. And guess what Cliff said? I can't do that. He's like, why not? Because you've paid for, it's an hour, I charge an hour, $300 for an hour, and it's not taking any time. I should have asked you this question when you said it was I've experienced that 2 times in the past. So, I should have thought about that. And here I made you wait 2 weeks and all this other stuff and blah, blah, blah. He goes, Cliff, you helped me. You solved it. Send me the invoice. And I was like, dude, I wouldn't be able to go to sleep tonight because I know that I haven't. I said, is there anything else you want to talk about? We have an entire hour. How can I Cliff, that's all I needed. Seriously, send me the invoice. I said, you know what? Just do me a favor. All I ask is that if anybody asks you who's the person that I should talk to related to podcast related stuff, if you'll send people my way and say good things about me, that's my payment for helping you today. He says, Cliff, are you sure? I'd really like you to send me the invoice. And I said, I'm absolutely sure. I would not be able to sleep with a good conscience because I have not earned your $300. And that's what I did not learn this right away. I learned this about 1.5 years after that event. But what I discovered is that, well, gosh, was that hard? No, that was one of the easiest things I ever did. And if I believe the more difficult something is, the more money you should have to pay to have it solved. And because it was so simple, the opposite, the less money I should get paid to have it solved. And the other one is the people are paying you for your time. So if I'm being paid for an hour and the hour hasn't even started yet, I haven't earned it. And then, of course, what was the other one? The more you love what you do. I love what I'm doing. I absolutely loved what I was doing. This was, and in a way, I told you, I was still struggling in those early days. I felt like I should be paying them. I couldn't believe people were willing to pay me money to talk about this one thing that I couldn't get anyone else in my hometown to talk to me about. And so all of that together, and so you combine all this together, those different beliefs, and that is what we call a belief system. And every belief inside of your belief system, every belief has a consequence. That's something I learned early on.
So tell us a bit more about your business then, Cliff. Do you still do that? Do you still do basically coaching and consulting for podcasters or wannabe podcasters?
I don't do any podcast technology related coaching and consulting today. At least I don't market it. Now, do I have one client right now who is a business owner who just sold his company for $2 million to a private equity firm, and now he's taking his industry experience and expertise and launching a podcast? And did he hear that I have a lot of experience and that he wanted me? Yes. And was he willing to pay me $15,000 for that? Yes. And so the average person who wants to launch a podcast isn't ready to invest $15,000 to work with me. So one of the things that I decided a long time ago is I want to do things that are incredibly valuable, such as absolutely shift the way people think and feel about things in life so that they can break free from any limiting belief, behavior, thoughts, or emotions that are keeping them from creating and or doing whatever they want to do in this world. And that has lots of value. And what I recognized is back in the day, I was teaching people how to podcast. I had a podcasting A to Z course. It was a 4-week group training program. You would have access to an entire online course. All of my tutorials were pre-done, and you could watch them, and every question you could possibly imagine is answered in the tutorials, and if you watched it, the answer was there. However, I also gave everybody access unlimited for 4 weeks. You could ask me any question for 4 weeks, and I will answer everything. So you could ask 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., I will answer all of your questions. But for 4 weeks only. And then on Fridays, I would host a 2-hour live Ask Me Anything, and it's first come, first serve, ask me anything, and I'll just answer them. And that was my 4-week course. It was $2,000. I had, by the way, 20 students every single session that I did until finally I decided I want to build the house that we wanted to build. And we went from hosting 4 of those a year. I went from hosting 4 of those a year to 6 of them a year. And for about a year and a half, I took the limit of 20 students off, and I averaged between 30 to 36 students per session at $2,000 a piece. So it was a pretty successful run if financially. But here's what happened. During this 4 weeks, I begged people to ask me questions beyond the technology. The technology's already covered. The only reason I left my career as an insurance agent was because of the powerful, positive impact and influence I was having in the lives of the people who were listening to my shows. I've got handwritten letters behind me from people who said, I chose not to commit suicide because of something you shared in your podcast. And countless number of messages from people who said, I'm now debt-free because you introduced me to the debt-free snowball program. Today, I'm reconciled to my wife, and my kids have a father in their life again because of something I heard you say in your podcast. This is why I got into podcasting, what really motivated me. And what was going on in this podcasting course, the first question I would ask everybody is, hey, before you get started, tell me, why do you want to have a podcast, and how will you know what success looks like? What will you have to achieve for you to know that this is successful for you? And what happened was I began to do coaching on a life and mindset level. And of course, also I recognized, because of the price point of my course, most of the people, not all, but most of the people were full-time self-employed business owners who wanted to create something around their business. So now I'm helping a lot of people learn some of the incredibly difficult lessons I learned in the early years of my business. I'm helping them break free from some of those limiting beliefs. And I'm also answering their technical questions, but also helping them see the limiting way that they're thinking is holding them back from creating what they want to create. They've got all these fears about imposter syndrome. They've got all these fears about, what will people say about me? What if I fail in front of people? How will I be perceived by others? All of these different things. It's like, listen, I want to have a conversation with you about these things. And what happened was, have you ever heard of the name Michael Hyatt before?
I haven't.
Okay. So there's a guy named Michael Hyatt. He's written a New York Times bestselling book called Platform: How to Get Noticed in a Noisy World. And back in the day, he had one of the most popular business or entrepreneurial blogs on the planet. And so he became a client of mine, and then a friend and a mentor. And one day I was having a conversation in my podcast, Answer Man podcast. This is one of the rare occasions when I interviewed someone. But when I interviewed somebody, it was usually somebody who I already knew incredibly well, and I knew the value that I had to bring to my audience. And here's what Michael Hyatt said to me.
Well, I've told you before, this is why I listen to your podcast. It's not because I need more technical information on podcasting. I just listen to you because I like the way that you think about life, how you approach the problems you're trying to solve, and just your voice. So you could be talking about anything, and I'd be interested.
So getting that feedback from him, and then hearing that same thing echoed by lots of other people, eventually that gave me the idea of, wow, what if I could actually do business strategy and business mindset coaching instead of podcast technical coaching? And I began to test the waters of that. I began to let people know I'm available for one-on-one again, which I hadn't done one-on-one in a long time. And I said, but here's the situation. Here's the cost of the package. This is how many sessions we're going to have. And we will not discuss the topic of podcasting. If you're interested, reach out to me. And to my surprise, I've got room for 10 people. And to my surprise, those 10 slots filled within 5 to 7 days of publishing that episode. And then after I served all of those and I saw the results that they got, I did it again, and I was able to duplicate it. And at that point, I began the process of transitioning my brand from Podcast Answer Man to Mindset Answer Man. And that's what I do today. So between my one-on-one coaching, my podcasting A to Z group coaching, and my online podcasting tutorials that you could purchase one-off, I've personally been involved in helping 40,000 plus people launch their podcasts. Some of my one-on-one clients have been John Lee Dumas of Entrepreneur on Fire, Amy Porterfield, Online Business Made Easy, Pat Flynn, Smart Passive Income. I could go on and on about the A-list people that I've worked with, and then the referrals that came in from that. And that was an incredible time. But like I said, there was a day when most of my emails were all day, can you help me figure out what this buzzing noise is in the background? And hey, I published my podcast episode of 2.5 hours ago, and it's still not in this directory. Can you help me pinpoint and troubleshoot what's going on here? And hey, Cliff, quick question. I just bought your tutorial on how to set up this exact equipment package, but I have a different interface device. Can you tell me what cable I need? And all day, every day was filled with that. And I'm like, listen, guys, this is absolutely a distraction from what I know is my greater purpose in this world. And also, I happen to know I had reached the upper limit of how much somebody will pay me for a technical answer that you could Google yourself. And so that's why I made that transition. It's like, no, you know what? I'm going to go all in on business strategy and mindset. I had all sorts of limiting beliefs about it. I was like, who am I to do this? I mean, I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for these people. Why don't people just go to them instead? I had all of the same things that I was helping other people overcome. And I'm like, well, I'm going to have to practice what I preach. And I went out and did it.
Wow. Cliff, that was amazing. We like to close those episodes with a question. And that question is, what are 3 podcasts that you're listening to that you would recommend to our audience? And of course, the only condition is you cannot name your podcast. In your case, your podcasts. So what do you listen to that you would recommend to our audience?
Well, I don't know necessarily about making a recommendation that people, what they should listen to, but I will answer the question of what has appealed to me. So the only podcast I'm listening to today from the This Week in Net and Tech podcast from Leo Laporte, he was the guy who introduced me to the world of podcasting. I have never missed an episode of Mac Break Weekly. I am a tech geek, tech enthusiast. I'm an Apple fanboy core all the way through. You don't even want to know how many iPads are sitting in front of me right now, how many different Apple devices. I am obsessed with Apple and their technology. So Mac Break Weekly, I never missed that podcast. Another podcast I still listen to, there are actually 2 different podcasts. One is called The Walk, and the other one is called The Break. And they're both from that Catholic priest in the Netherlands that I've been listening to since the summer of 2005. His name is Father Roderick Von Hogen, and he's actually a close personal friend and also today one of my coaching clients. So I listen to his podcasts every single week, and I have for years. And then I'll list a third show that I love. It's called It's a Drama.
It's called like this.
Yeah, it's called IT''S a drama. And it's kind of like Life is a Drama. It's a drama. That's the name, and it's by Brian and Liz Deacle. And they are a couple who are from England, but who have migrated to or have moved to New Zealand. And they are an amazing couple who loves to travel the world. And when I first met them, They were on a 6-month journey of traveling all through all of these different countries and podcasting every week about what they're experiencing along their travels. And since then, they've, ended that travel series and they're back in New Zealand, but I get to hear about what their life is like in New Zealand, which I've been to New Zealand for 10 days back in the day, speaking at the Asia Pacific Podcast Conference back then. So I love New Zealand, and I love to hear this couple just talk about their life. It's just real life behind the microphone, hearing what somebody else is perceiving of their experience on this planet.
Cliff, that was an amazing episode. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted that our paths have crossed. I'm honored for this opportunity to be here on this podcast.